Sony brought out the FX3 in February of 2021, taking the A7S III, what was already a video-focused camera, and they made a video version of that camera. Stripped a few things out, but made this essentially more of a cinema-style body. And this has been my go-to camera ever since. So we're 3.5 years later. This is my long-term update. Now, the biggest thing you're going to want to hear right up front is, after everything that I've shot, countless weddings, real estate videos, YouTube videos, no problems, nothing whatsoever. No freezing up of the camera, no overheating, even being in the desert. All the places I've been with this, no problems. Of all the things that you can say when it comes to a camera, that is probably one of the best things. I have run the battery on this down to 0, to the point where the camera physically turns off in the middle of recording a clip. It closes off the file. It is just an incredibly reliable camera. Now, in terms of overheating, I wouldn't have expected any anyway, because it does have that built-in fan. It's one of the first Sony alpha, I mean, it's not an alpha camera, but more compact bodies that isn't an FX6 or an FX9 or a Venice that has a fan built into it. So I haven't had any overheating issues. I haven't spoken or chatted with anybody that has ever had any overheating issues, and that is very much likely down to the fan. This is one of those cameras that even 3.5 years later still sells very well, and I kind of believe that if Sony was to release this today, not having previously known about this camera, it would still sell ridiculously well. And that says a lot about this. Look at the used market for these. That very much speaks to how popular a camera is. This thing holds its value incredibly well. I could sell this right now and probably only lose a few $100s, which is basically a ridiculously cheap long-term rental. I'm not going to sell it, but I could. And that speaks volumes to the FX3. This camera now is just the camera that, if I know I'm shooting video that I am getting paid for, there's no question about what camera I'm using. It's this. This is what I'm going to pick up. 95% of the time, this is the choice of camera that's getting picked up, loaded into the bag with whatever lenses I need, the FX3. It's almost an assumption now that if you shoot Sony predominantly and you mostly focus on video, you're probably going to have an FX3. So many people are using this specific camera to shoot a huge variety of different things all over the world. It is probably one of the most popular video cameras out there right now. And I think one of the big reasons that people like this is the fact that it is so small. Now, I do have a little bit of a rig on here right now. This is actually a plate that I recently picked up, which I'm really enjoying. It just offsets the mount points on the top of the camera a little bit further forwards, and there's a NATO rail on there, and that allows you to mount a monitor and a mic, or the DJI mic, at the same time. So I really like that. And I've got a little plate on the bottom here as well, just for mounting to various different tripods. This on its own, when you've got it outside of any form of rig, is a really small camera in itself, which makes it really easy for packing, for traveling with you. It's not a pocket camera by any means, like you can't put it in your pocket, but in terms of packing in a bag when it's de-rigged, there's no lens on it, it's really small compared to some other options out there. Now, yes, it's not the A7S III, and should you get this or the A7S III in 2024, we'll talk about that more towards the end, but if you want to use this for still, you can. A lot of people forget that this is still a stills camera. There is no EVF on there, but it shoots 12 megapixel stills the same way the A7S III does. Now, I don't really use this for stills, but the fact that it has the ability to do so, if you're in a pinch and you don't have another camera with you, you can easily grab stills on this and they're going to suffice. 12 megapixels is more than enough for the majority of things. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise, especially with the upscaling AI stuff that you can do in Photoshop now. More than enough if you need to use this for stills in a pinch. If you're new here and you're enjoying this video, you're getting value out of it, consider subscribing. There's no contract. You can just click that button down below, and it actually does help, believe it or not. And if at any time you just like, I don't like this guy anymore, you can click it again and unsubscribe, but it helps a lot. Back to the video. This is one of the first kind of smaller mirrorless cameras from Sony, other than the FX30 now, that actually has mounting points on the body itself. So you've got one on the side there, you've got 2 on the side here, 3 on the top there, and it just allows you to rig this in any way you need to use it. Whether you need a handheld rig, you need a car rig for roller shots, you need a gimbal rig, you want to put this on a Cinelifter FPV drone, you want to put this in the Cineback to make it more like an FX6, which we'll get into talking about in a bit as well. There's just unlimited mounting options with this camera because it's so small, it's so compact. There's a million different styles of cages and rigs and setup videos out there. It's just so versatile for putting into any kind of situation. Now, if you're not familiar with what the Cineback is, it's something that came out last year, and it allows you to make the FX3 more of a boxy style cinema camera. Now, I've done a whole video on it, which I'll pop up there for you. I had an FX6 for 2 or 3 years, and I did love that camera. I love the form factor of shooting with a cinema camera. There is nothing else like having like a big rig that has weight, that produces micro shakes, and you can just mount everything to it. But the FX6 did have its quirks, and every time I'd use the FX6, there was aspects of this camera that I wanted in that. Predominantly little things like the IBIS, the simplicity of sometimes using this versus the FX6. Now the FX6, yes, does have the ND, but sometimes there's a trade-off. When I rigged this out with the Cineback setup, which is 2 different versions, you can get one with the top handle, one without the audio top handle. Everything was connected, and I picked this up for the first time. I immediately realized, like, this is it, I don't need the FX6 anymore. Now, there are going to be people out there that disagree with me in that statement, but if you've tried the Cineback, especially with the top handle, you will immediately know what I mean. It feels like a cinema camera that was just brought out as like one unit. It works incredibly well, and if you've been looking at an FX6 for a while, because maybe you have an FX3, try the Cineback first. If you can maybe borrow one from someone else, just get it in your hands, you'll see what I mean. Now, there will be people that disagree with this, but this is a cinema camera. Sony put it out as part of their Cine line, it says so on the top there, and since it's come out, there's been various firmware updates that make it even more of a cinema camera. Specifically things like DCI 4K, the ability to have time code, and I know there's a big one that everyone wants, the shutter angle, but it is coming from what I've seen.
Hey everybody, my name is Jay. I'm the product manager for the FX3, and we announced that there will be a shutter angle available. And currently I have a beta camera that have the menu system. So when you press the menu system, in the quick shoot here, you see, you got a shutter angle now.
Arguably, that is something that probably should have been on this camera when it first came out, but it is coming. So yes, this is a cinema camera. It has been used in cinema to make big Hollywood films. The creator, obviously a massive film, brought a huge amount of attention to this camera because it was shot, a lot of that movie was shot with this camera, utilizing kind of natural light environments with minimal lighting and just utilizing the second base ISO of this camera. This was a pick because of how small it was and how it could be rigged and used in situations to just jump in and start filming quickly. One of the nice other updates that we got in terms of a firmware was adding the, I'm not sure what they call them, but the first 2 menus you get at the top now that allow you to quickly change settings on the fly. So if you want to have a few quick custom settings that you use to change, you can jump in the menus quickly and change that. But you also have the full menus that you can still access. There are some people that like to use those menus. There's some people that like to use the function menu at the bottom there as well. Basically, however you want to use this camera, you can use it specifically to you. There's not one way that you have to use it that not everyone's going to like. There's multiple ways that you can use this camera in terms of menus and settings and changing things when you're out and about shooting. Kind of goes hand in hand with what I just said, but you also have the ability to use the Cine EI setting on here or the flexible ISO, depending on how you like to shoot. So again, it's flexible. However you want to use it, for however suits you best, you're not fixed into using it one specific way. If you want to use it more like a traditional mirrorless camera, you can do that with flexible ISO. I actually find myself doing that a lot. But if you want to use it more like the cinema cameras, like in the FX6 and the FX9, you can use the Cine EI setting. Now, with this camera being 3.5 years old, you're going to get people that are like, well, the autofocus isn't as good as it could be. No, don't listen to that. The amount of autofocus has a time and a place, right? And the longer I do this, the more I'm starting to play around with manual focus lenses, things like anamorphics, and I realize there's a time and a place for manual focus as well. But a lot of people, talking to what I know, use this camera specifically for things like weddings, because weddings are incredibly fast-paced environments. Things are happening once: first kisses, first walks down the aisle, first looks, and you need precision with autofocus, you need reliability, and this thing is exactly that. The eye autofocus, the tracking, when you tap on something, it still does an incredible job when it comes to autofocus. Even all these years later, even with the A7R5's latest AI tech, the camera I'm shooting with right now is the A7R5, this still is not as good as that camera, but this is still ridiculously good, versatile, and works 99% of the time when it comes to autofocus when you need it to, which is what's important. If you're worried about buying this camera in 2024 because it's an older quote unquote camera now, it still holds up when it comes to autofocus. You need to use autofocus for certain situations, and event coverage is one of those things where it's kind of silly just to not use autofocus, and you can rely on this camera. The dual native ISO, you can shoot at 640 for your ISO or 12,800, and there's a huge difference there in terms of the lighting situations that you need to be in to use each of those. And it is so handy to have that 12,800, especially for event coverage, or if you're shooting when it starts to get a little bit darker at night. You can just put it to 12,800 and not have to worry. You get an incredibly clean image. In actual fact, what I find myself doing a lot of the time now, and there's so many other people out there that I know do the same, is I'll put this into 12,800 and I'll use an ND filter to stop down, because then you can just adjust the ND filter to get the exposure that you need, and it's just easier. Now, you might be wondering, well, why would you even do that? Why not just change the ISO? Well, if you're looking for the cleanest possible image that you can get, you're going to want to shoot at one of the two base ISOs, 640 or 12,800. Now, you might find situations when your exposure might be around that like 4,000 ISO mark. And this is where it starts to beg the question, do you want to shoot at 4,000 ISO and maybe have a little bit of noise in there? Or do you want to go up to 12,800, clean it up, and then just use your ND filter to stop down? So that's why you would do that. That's why I do that. And that's why you find a lot of other people doing the same thing as well. Dual base ISOs, that variety, 640 and 12,800, is something that I still use on an everyday basis, and you will love on this camera. Now, it's not the first Sony camera to obviously shoot with 10-bit video, but it is one of those things, again, that you just appreciate. And the files on this are so easy to work with. And you can shoot with this even in the most compressed codec, throw it into the timeline, and not really need to use proxies. Sometimes I will create proxies still if I'm working with multiple layers of video, but you don't necessarily need to. 10-bit files just allow you so much flexibility to rescue things, to salvage things. If you mess up your white balance, you can just so easily correct it. And the fact that you can do that on this camera in 24 frames per second, 30, 60, 120 frames per second makes this camera just, again, incredibly versatile for shooting everything and anything you possibly want in the video world. I, like a lot of other people, use the Phantom LUTs because if you want a one-click, people don't like that phrase, one-click LUT, but you can use these as a one-click LUT if you want to. And now I am an affiliate with the Phantom LUTs. I've talked about them so much. They're just a really quick and easy way to get good video. Or if you want a good base for a video, just straight from the log, you don't have to convert it to Rec 709 first. The Phantom LUT does it for you. Joel, who makes these, he's a cinematographer, he knows what he's talking about. They make them for all their cameras now, for Nikon, for Canon, for DJI. Like, if you want to try them out, like, they're super handy. If you're just starting with Sony FX3, any of the Sony cameras, try the Phantom LUTs. You will be very impressed by just how quickly and easily you can grade with them. There's a discount code down below and a link if you want to try them out. But they have been a huge part of how I use this camera. I have those LUTs actually loaded into this camera so I can preview them when I'm out and about, because you can preview your LUTs on this camera. You can bake them in if you want to as well. So I love the Phantom LUTs, and just working with the files that come out of the FX3 10-bit in 60, 120, really, really nice. Now, if you're buying this camera, I would highly recommend that you buy it with the audio top handle. It does add a decent amount of bulk to this camera, but it gives you the XLR options if you end up going with like a cineback as well. I would highly recommend that you buy it with the audio top handle, even if you're not using it all the time. It's also worth noting that that audio top handle does screw into the top here, but you can use it with a lot of Sony cameras as well, and it just slides on to the multi-interface shoe. It doesn't screw in. Like the A7R5, I use it with that all the time. You have to be careful because it could just fall out, but you can slide it in there and it does work. So the audio top handle isn't just for this, works with other cameras as well. You know, one of my favorite features about this camera is the focus magnifier button. Now, this is one thing I always customize to any camera that I'm using, no matter if I'm playing about with a Nikon or a Panasonic. I always want a zoom magnifier button just to check my focus. If I'm manually focusing, you can just tap that button and see that everything is as it's meant to be. So having that little focus button on there is probably one of my favorite features of this camera, paired with the multiple record buttons. Oh, I'm not going to be able to record. We need a memory card. All right, we found one. What was I saying? The big record buttons on this camera. So you've got the big red one there. You've got the one on the front there. And the tally lights on this camera, you've got the one there. You've got, where's the, oh, the big one on the back there. And then the emphasized recording box on there as well. I really love the placement of these tally lights and these buttons. It just means whatever way you're holding the camera, like if I'm shooting this way, I can see it's recording there. If I'm shooting top down, I can see that I'm recording there. The big one on the back here means that if you're not next to your camera, you may be recording from two angles and you need to quickly look to see that they're both recording still. That big long one there is you're able to see it from a distance. So these were really well thought out, and don't undervalue how useful tally lights are, and I love the placement of these. The finish of this camera is the same as the FX6, same color kind of finish on it, and it was different to anything Sony had before with their mirrorless cameras. And I've got to say, and I'll show you some B-roll to back this up, everywhere this camera has been with me, so many different trips, thrown in and out of bags, on and off of cages, on and off of gimbals, it still looks in immaculate condition. The only wear on here is on the top multi-interface shoe there, where it's I guess black anodized finish, and it's starting to chip a little bit just from sliding things on and off all the time. Sometimes things are metal, sometimes aren't. But the general finish of this camera all the way around, even the grip, like there's nowhere on here where it starts to look like it is an old camera other than on the top there. So Sony did a really good job with the finish of this camera. And if you're buying this used, you're going on the used market, with the amount that I use my camera in the desert, in the snow, up mountains, like vlogging, everything I've done, you should expect a camera to really look in as good condition as this. And if it does have marks and chips and things like that, I would question as to where that camera's been. Mine's been through a lot and it still looks in immaculate condition. Two questions I get asked a lot. Should you buy the FX3 in 2024, or should you potentially wait for an FX3 Mark II or FX4 or whatever that ends up being called? And should you buy this or the A7S3? Well, should you buy this or the A7S3? I don't really need to talk about that too much. I've done a whole video, I think I did 2 videos on it covering that, and you can watch that up here. Everything I said there still applies, and you should just watch that. But in regards to buying this in 2024, should you buy it? Well, look at the specs of this camera right now. Does it do everything you need it to do? If yes, just buy this camera now, because nobody knows when or if the new version of this camera is coming. And nobody knows what it will have. There's a lot of asks out there of what this camera could do if it was updated. And I think a lot of the asks that people have are very specific to certain things, but there is a general list of things I think we could potentially see in a new version of this camera. So should you still buy this in 2024? Absolutely. But with that said, what would I like to see in a new version of this camera? And what do I think we might see based off of the general kind of consensus of what everybody wants? I think one of the big asks is 6K. Obviously, more and more cameras are shooting 6K these days, and open gate. So you can shoot both this way and this way. Now there's a lot of information out there that says like, oh, if you have open gate, you don't have to really worry about your vertical framing. You can just shoot one way and be able to get both a crop for horizontal and for vertical. And that is somewhat true, but I do stand by the fact that if you want to compose vertically, you should compose vertically. If you want to compose horizontally, you should compose horizontally. And if you are making a predominantly vertical video, you should just shoot it vertical and not rely on open gate. The framing isn't perfect, it just gives you more flexibility. But I would still love to see 6K open gate in this camera, in the new version of this camera, if we get that. I'm sure we'll get it, just when. I'd love to see a better screen on this camera, higher res, more like the A7R5 screen. And with the A7R5 screen, you also have that multi-vari-angle, I always forget the name of it, where you can go out like that, but you can also tilt it up. I'd love to see that screen on here. And this is probably one of the biggest asks. And I kind of feel like we might get this. An ND filter, however many stops that ends up being. I really do think that's a big ask from a lot of people with the new version of this. I don't know how that will look in terms of making the body bigger or wider or fatter, how that will affect battery life and image quality, because ND filters, sometimes when they're internal, they can have an effect on the image, like a color cast or something like that. So I don't know how that will look, but I do think that is a big ask from a lot of people. And I think if Sony somehow manages to put that in here, it will do a lot to push people towards whatever that camera is, and it will be a big reason for people to upgrade. And that's one of the big things, really. Like, you got to think about this camera, as I said earlier, is still a camera that could come out today in 2024, and a lot of people will still be like, wow, if this didn't already exist, if the A7S3 didn't already exist. So they've got to do something really to kind of wow people, to entice them to upgrade. And that, I think, is one of the biggest things they could do. This is more something I've wanted recently, but after shooting with these Blazar Remus anamorphics, these are a 1.5x stretch, and Sony did add the ability to de-stretch within camera last year, I think, but there's only 1.3 and 2. So there's none of that 1.5x de-stretch on there, which means the footage doesn't look as it's meant to look, and it's kind of harder to compose. So I would love to see more de-stretch options within the camera. I would also personally love to be able to de-stretch and bake that into the footage, but that is more of a higher end, like ARRI cinema feature. Probably a bit more niche too. Better IBIS is something I'd like to see, something like the A7R5. A lot of people don't understand that the A7R5 has the best Sony IBIS out there, and when you see it and you use it, it is better than everything that is out there Sony wise. I know Gerald did a video on the FX3 saying how that was the best Sony camera for IBIS. The A7R5 is better, believe me. I use it all the time, and it shocks people. It basically looks like a tripod when you're holding it. I can use the A7R5 with 135mm f1.8G master, and it looks like you're on a tripod. It's ridiculous. So I'd love to see that IBIS tech brought into here. It's not really a huge thing, but if we had things like false color in this, I think that would go a long way. False color is a very heavily used video tool when it comes to professional work. There's a lot of situations where it can be more beneficial than a histogram, which you get tiny in the corner there, and being able to customize the size of those tools, move them around on the screen like you can with the Panasonic S5 2X. I'd really think those would be useful features if they could add that. And then more of a personal ask, but something I find very useful when I'm using the A7 C2 and the A7R5 is that, and this is to do with the sensor size in this, and it's only a 12 megapixel sensor, you can't crop in 4K to get closer, like a 1.5 times crop. I actually use that quite a bit, so I'd love to be able to see that in here. Now I know that's probably going to be a lot harder to do because of the sensor size, but it really depends what Sony ends up doing in terms of the sensor they put in the newer version, whether that'll be possible or not. I think that's it. I think that's everything I have to say for now about the FX3. 3.5 years later, it's still my go-to for most video work. And if you end up buying this, you will immediately find the same. You won't be disappointed by this camera. Nice work, Sony, on creating a camera that I think changed the game for a lot of people. That's it. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.